Minerva Winslow's hands never trembled when she stitched a wound. Not during the war when boys younger than her own son bled out beneath her needle. Not in the years since as Coleridge's only doctor. And yet as she traced the scar on her left wrist, a clean, deliberate line that marked her darkest hour. Her fingers quivered like autumn leaves clinging to their branches. Outside, Whisper Creek murmured beneath a thin crust of January ice. The water kept flowing, regardless, even when unseen, even when poisoned. She placed her husband's pocket watch on the table, its face reflecting the lamplight in small golden bursts. Thomas had wound it faithfully each morning until the day the mine collapsed. William had asked to inherit this ritual, but fever took him before he could learn it properly. May pressed her thumb against the watch's cold surface. Then methodically she began to wind it for the first time in 2 years. The water of Whisper Creek carried secrets. In summer it babbled with them, a constant murmur beneath the cottonwoods and willows. In autumn it whispered them into the golden leaves that floated on its surface. But in winter, the creek kept its secrets locked beneath a thin crust of ice visible through the translucent surface, like shadows of the dead. Minerva Mae Winslow knew about secrets. She had been carrying them for so long, they had become part of her, like the web of scars across her hands from years of surgical work, or the single cleaner line that ran across her left wrist, usually hidden beneath the sleeve of her dress. It was the winter of 1872, and Wyoming Territory was in the grip of a cold that made men whisper about the end times. May's cabin sat a half-mile from Whisper Creek, far enough from the small settlement of Coleridge that folks had to make a deliberate journey to reach her, but close enough that they would come when fever or injury left them no choice. They called her Doc Winslow these days, though she had never claimed that title. She had been a nurse during the war between the states, one of the women who had stood ankle-deep in blood and viscera, stitching what remained of men back together while surgeons moved on to fresher cases. The formal training had come later quietly from a sympathetic physician in Chicago who saw something in the stern, silent woman that reminded him of his own daughter lost to typhoid. But here in this remote corner of the territory, degrees and formal titles mattered less than results, and Mae Winslow could stitch a wound, set a bone, and ease a fever better than most physicians who had passed through Coleridge. "You ought to charge more," said the woman sitting at May's scarred oak table, nursing a cup of willow bark tea. "Tom Sanders would have lost that hand if not for you." May's hands didn't pause as she sorted dried herbs into small pouches. "He paid what he could. A brace of rabbits ain't proper payment for saving a man's livelihood." "Perhaps not in Denver, Rebecca." May glanced up. "But we're not in Denver." Rebecca Morrison sighed, touching the high collar of her dress, where it concealed the edge of a purple bruise. She had arrived an hour earlier, ostensibly, to deliver a basket of fresh eggs and cornbread, but May knew the real reason. The bruise had been visible when Rebecca removed her coat just for a moment before the collar was adjusted. It wasn't the first time, nor would it be the last. Sheriff Calvin Morrison had a reputation for fairness in public and cruelty in private, at least to his wife. "How are the headaches?" May asked, changing the subject. Rebecca's fingers tightened on her cup. "Better with the tincture you made. Cal doesn't like me taking it. Says medicine makes a person weak." "Calvin Morrison wouldn't know strength if it introduced itself with a calling card," May replied dryly. A ghost of a smile touched Rebecca's lips before fading. "There's talk in town about the water." May's hands stilled. "What kind of talk?" "The Western Irrigation Consortium representatives are back. Third time this year. They held a meeting at the Cattlemen's Association yesterday. Cal wouldn't tell me what it was about, but I heard him talking to one of them later about acquiring water rights along the creek." Rebecca leaned forward. "You should be careful, May. Your claim is small, but the creek runs through it," May finished. She had heard the warnings before. Rebecca nodded, then winced as the movement aggravated some hidden pain. "They're saying the consortium can help bring prosperity, that with proper management the whole valley could bloom." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "But I've heard other things too. About farms where the water turned bad after they refused to sell. About men who had accidents." May thought of her own husband 3 years in the cold ground. Of the official report that said Thomas Winslow had died when a support beam collapsed in the silver mine northeast of town. Of the foreman who couldn't quite meet her eyes at the funeral. She thought of their son William, who had fallen ill 6 months later. The doctor from Casper had called it mountain fever, but Mae had seen enough disease to know the symptoms didn't match. The boy had wasted away, complaining that the water tasted strange until one morning he didn't wake at all. "I'm careful, Rebecca," Mae said finally. "Always have been." Rebecca seemed about to say more when the distant sound of hoofbeats made them both tense. Mae moved to the window, peering through frost-edged glass. "It's just Eli," she said, recognizing the rangy form of the town's telegraph operator. "Probably another message from Dr. Kent." The Philadelphia physician had been corresponding with Mae for months, sending questions about certain ailments common to mining communities. She suspected he had an academic paper in mind, though he had never said as much. Rebecca rose, smoothing her skirts. "I should go before Cal wonders where I am." She hesitated. "Mae, be careful who you trust, even old friends." There was something in Rebecca's tone that made Mae look at her sharply, but before she could question it, Rebecca had gathered her things and was heading for the door. "I'll come by next week with more eggs," she said, voice returned to its normal pitch for the benefit of the approaching rider. Mae watched her go, the warning lingering in the air, like the scent of gun oil after a weapon has been cleaned. The blizzard came in the late afternoon, turning the world white and formless. Mae had seen the signs earlier, the peculiar stillness of the air, the way the birds had gone silent, and had prepared accordingly. Wood was stacked beside the hearth, water drawn from the well lamps filled with oil. She spent the evening reading by lamplight a medical text Dr. Kent had sent her, detailing the latest theories on waterborne disease. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the shutters and finding every crack in the cabin's seasoned logs. It was nearly midnight when she heard it, a sound distinct from the storm's fury, a sharp crack like a branch breaking under the weight of snow, followed by a dull thud. Mae set aside her book, listening. Another sound, fainter this time. Could be anything, she told herself. A deer, a wolf, the old pine near the creek, finally giving up its fight with time. But it could also be a person. Mae sighed, knowing sleep would elude her now. She rose, buttoned her heavy wool cardigan, and lit a lantern. From the corner cabinet, she took her husband's old Colt revolver, checking that it was loaded before slipping it into her pocket. The bitter cold struck her like a physical blow as she opened the door, the lantern's glow creating a small sphere of visibility in the swirling snow. Mae pulled her scarf higher across her face and stepped out, moving carefully on the treacherous ground. She had not gone 20 yards when she saw it, a dark shape huddled against the trunk of a pine. For a moment she thought it was indeed a fallen branch, but then she caught the faint steam of breath in the frigid air. "Hello," she called, raising the lantern higher. No response came from the figure. Mae approached cautiously, her free hand on the revolver in her pocket. As she drew closer, the shape resolved into a man slumped on his side in the snow. Blood had frozen in dark crystals on an expensive wool coat, spreading from a wound in his chest. Mae crouched beside him, setting the lantern down to check for a pulse. It was there, faint but steady against her fingertips. "Can you hear me?" she asked, gently turning his face toward the light. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps in his late 30s, with features that spoke of money and education, a straight nose, a strong jawline with a day's worth of stubble, and dark hair threaded with silver at the temples. His skin was pale from blood loss and cold, but there was something oddly familiar about him, like a face glimpsed in a half-forgotten dream. The man's eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes as gray as the winter sky. They focused on her face for a brief moment before closing again. "Help me," he whispered, the words barely audible above the wind. Mae made her decision instantly. "I'm going to move you," she said, though she wasn't sure he could hear. "This will hurt." With strength born of years tending wounded soldiers and hauling her own supplies, Mae got her arms under the man's shoulders and began to drag him toward the cabin. He was tall and solidly built, and by the time they reached the door, her lungs burned with the effort and the cold. Once inside, she managed to maneuver him onto the narrow bed near the hearth, where she kept patience when necessary. The warmth of the cabin began to melt the snow on his clothes, revealing more of the dark stain that spread across his chest. Mae worked methodically, cutting away the expensive coat and the blood-soaked shirt beneath. The wound was a bullet hole, the lead still lodged inside from what she could tell. Not a clean through and through like she'd seen on the battlefield, but not immediately fatal either. As she cleaned away the blood, she noticed other marks on his body. Old scars, some from what looked like previous bullet wounds, and one long knife scar across his abdomen that had been stitched by a skilled hand. This was not a man unaccustomed to violence. The stranger stirred as she probed the wound, a groan escaping his lips. "Easy," May murmured, reaching for her medical kit. "You've been shot, but you're safe now." His eyes opened again, clearer this time, darting around the cabin before settling on her face. "Where?" "My cabin, half a mile east of Whisper Creek. I'm a doctor of sorts." May prepared a syringe of morphine, measuring the dose carefully. "This will help with the pain while I remove the bullet." He tried to focus on her confusion, evident in his expression. "You," he began, then winced as she administered the injection. "Questions later," May said firmly. "Right now, you need to be still." As the morphine took effect, his muscles relaxed and his eyes drifted closed again. May took the opportunity to check his pockets, looking for identification or anything that might tell her who he'd encountered the wrong end of a gun. In an inner pocket of the ruined coat, she found a wallet of fine leather. Inside was a considerable sum of money and a business card, Nathaniel Preston, Western Irrigation Consortium. May's breath caught. The very organization Rebecca had warned her about. Tucked behind the money was a folded photograph, worn at the edges, as if handled often. May opened it carefully and felt the world tilt beneath her. The photograph showed a field hospital, clearly from during the war. White tents in the background, stretchers in the foreground, and a group of nurses and doctors standing together, expressions grim but determined. And there among them, younger and less careworn, was May herself, staring at the camera with the same intensity she now directed at the wounded man on her bed. She didn't remember this photograph being taken, though that wasn't unusual. There had been many such moments during the war, documented by photographers eager to capture the conflict for posterity. But why would this man have it, and why would it show signs of frequent handling? Setting the photograph aside, May returned to the more pressing matter of the bullet in her patient's chest. With practiced hands, she prepared her instruments, sterilizing them in boiling water and setting out rolls of clean bandages. The bullet had lodged against a rib, which had likely saved his life by preventing the lead from penetrating deeper into the lung. May worked carefully, extracting the misshapen projectile with a pair of long forceps before cleaning and closing the wound with neat stitches. Throughout the procedure, the man remained unconscious, though he occasionally muttered words she couldn't catch. Once he called out a name, Amelia, with such anguish that May paused, wondering who this woman was to him. It was nearly dawn by the time she finished washing away the last traces of blood and applying a poultice of herbs to help prevent infection. The blizzard had abated somewhat, though snow still fell steadily outside the frost-covered windows. May stoked the fire, then settled into the chair beside the bed, studying her mysterious patient. In sleep, the hard lines of his face softened, making him appear more vulnerable than the scars on his body suggested. Who was he, and why was he carrying a photograph of her from the war? The most logical explanation was that he was exactly what his card claimed, a representative of the consortium, perhaps researching the backgrounds of locals who might resist their plans. That would explain the photograph, though not the bullet wound. But as May watched him sleep, another possibility formed in her mind, one that sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the winter storm outside. She had heard whispers of federal agents infiltrating certain businesses, suspected of corruption of men who posed as employees to gather evidence of wrongdoing. Such men often met unfortunate ends when their true purposes were discovered. If that was the case, she had just invited a world of trouble into her home. May touched the revolver in her pocket, considering her options. She could turn him over to Sheriff Morrison when the storm cleared, but if her suspicions were correct, that might be signing his death warrant. She could demand answers when he woke, but a man in his condition might say anything to ensure his safety. Or she could wait, watch, and judge for herself whether Nathaniel Preston was a threat or a victim. The decision made itself as May's eyes fell on the photograph again. Whatever this man's purpose, he had carried her image with him, handled it enough to wear the edges smooth. There was a story there that went beyond simple investigation, and Mae Winslow had always been drawn to stories without easy explanations. He woke in stages, awareness returning in fragments. First came the pain, a dull throb in his chest that sharpened with each breath. Then the sensations, warmth from a nearby fire, the scratch of rough cotton sheets, the smell of herbs and wood smoke. Finally, memory, the meeting at the consortium's regional office. The discovery of the water survey maps the urgent ride through the gathering storm and then the ambush. Two riders emerging from the trees, the crack of a rifle, the impact that knocked him from his horse. He had managed to return fire, hitting one of his attackers before stumbling away into the forest, knowing he had to reach Coleridge, had to find. His eyes snapped open as the final piece slid into place. "You're awake." The voice came from his right, calm and measured. He turned his head to see a woman seated in a wooden chair, a book open in her lap. She was perhaps 40, with chestnut hair streaked with silver, pulled back in a severe knot at the nape of her neck. Her face might have been beautiful once before time, and hardship had carved it into something more interesting. Strong cheekbones, a straight nose, and eyes the color of the sea in winter, a shifting blue-gray that seemed to see beyond surfaces. Those eyes were watching him now, with a mixture of professional concern and personal wariness. "How long?" His voice emerged as a rasp, his throat dry from disuse. "3 days." She set aside her book and rose, moving to a table where she poured water from a pitcher into a cup. "The fever broke yesterday. I wasn't sure you'd wake today, but your breathing changed an hour ago." She brought the cup to him, supporting his head as he drank. The water was cool and tasted faintly of mint. "Thank you," he said when he had drained the cup. "You're welcome, Mr. Preston." The use of that name made him tense, which sent a fresh wave of pain through his chest. She noticed, of course. Those sea-glass eyes didn't miss much. "I found your identification," she explained, returning to her chair, "along with a rather interesting photograph." He closed his eyes, briefly gathering his thoughts. The plan had been meticulously constructed over months, the identity of Nathaniel Preston carefully established within the consortium. To abandon it now would mean losing all that work, all the evidence he'd gathered. But there was the photograph, his one indulgence, his one connection to a past he'd tried to leave behind. And now it had compromised him with the very person he'd been searching for. "My name isn't Nathaniel Preston," he said finally. A flicker of something satisfaction perhaps crossed her face. "I didn't think it was. It's Gabriel. Gabriel Hurst." She studied him for a long moment. "And who is Gabriel Hurst when he isn't pretending to work for the Western Irrigation Consortium?" The direct question caught him off guard. He had expected more caution, more circling. But Minerva Winslow had never been one for unnecessary words, that much he remembered. "I'm a journalist," he said, offering the half-truth that was their agreed-upon cover. "Investigating the consortium's business practices for the Chicago Tribune?" She raised an eyebrow. "A dangerous occupation, apparently." "More so than I anticipated," Gabriel admitted, wincing as he shifted position. "I discovered some documents, maps showing underground water sources that aren't on any official surveys. The consortium has been buying up land that seems worthless, but which sits atop these aquifers. And someone shot you for this knowledge," Mae said, not phrasing it as a question. "Two men. I didn't recognize them, but they knew who I was, or rather, who they thought I was." Mae nodded slowly, processing this information. "That explains the bullet. It doesn't explain the photograph." Gabriel had hoped she might overlook that detail, but he should have known better. Minerva Winslow had been renowned for her attention to detail during the war, catching infections before they manifested and spotting internal bleeding that more experienced doctors missed. "I was a soldier," he said, telling another partial truth. "Cavalry. I was wounded at Antietam, sent to a field hospital. You were there." Her expression remained neutral, but he saw the slight narrowing of her eyes. "I was at many field hospitals, Mr. Hurst. I don't recall meeting you." "You wouldn't," he said. "I was one of dozens of wounded men brought in that day. But you were the one who found the piece of shrapnel the surgeons missed, the one that would have killed me if it had shifted closer to my heart." This was true, at least. He remembered waking to find her bent over him, her face intent, as she extracted the metal fragment from his chest, mere millimeters from his aorta. "The photographer came the next day," Gabriel continued. "I was still delirious with fever, but I remember the flash, the smell of chemicals. When I recovered, I asked who the nurse was, who had saved my life. Someone gave me her name and later a copy of that photograph." Mae's eyes never left his face as he spoke. "And you kept it all these years. A picture of a nurse you never spoke to." "I'm alive because of you," Gabriel said simply. She considered this, then stood abruptly. "You need to rest. The bullet tore through muscle but missed anything vital. You were lucky." Or perhaps well looked after, he suggested. Mae moved to the fire, adding another log to the flames. Your clothes were ruined, but I'll find something you can wear once you're able to move around. In the meantime, there's broth if you're hungry. The change of subject was deliberate. Gabriel knew. She was uncomfortable with gratitude, always had been. That at least hadn't changed. I'd appreciate that, he said. As she busied herself at the stove, Gabriel took the opportunity to study his surroundings more carefully. The cabin was small but meticulously organized. One wall was lined with shelves holding books, jars of herbs, and medical instruments. A desk beneath the window held papers and more books, some open with notes in the margins. The other end of the single room contained a small dining table, the stove, and a curtained area that presumably concealed Mae's personal space. Everything was plain but well-made, practical without being austere. It was exactly the sort of place he had imagined she would inhabit. "How did you find me?" Mae asked suddenly, returning with a bowl of steaming broth. "After all these years." Gabriel accepted the bowl carefully. "I didn't, not deliberately. I was assigned to investigate the consortium's activities in Wyoming Territory. It was only when I reached Coleridge that I heard about the lady doctor who lived near Whisper Creek." He paused. "I wasn't even certain it was you until I saw you that night." It was another partial truth. The investigation had indeed brought him to Wyoming, but he had specifically requested this territory, this region, knowing she was here. The photograph had been his talisman, his reminder of the debt he carried and the promise he had made to himself. Mae seemed to sense the omission, but she let it pass. "You're lucky I found you when I did. Another hour in that cold with that wound, and we wouldn't be having this conversation." "God works in mysterious ways," Gabriel murmured. A shadow passed over Mae's face. "Does he? I hadn't noticed." The bitterness in her voice was new, or at least more pronounced than he remembered. Whatever faith had sustained her during the war's darkest hours seemed to have abandoned her in the years since. "I'm sorry," he said, though he wasn't sure what for. Mae waved away his apology. "Eat your broth, Mr. Hurst. When you're stronger, we can discuss what to do about your situation." Gabriel obeyed, sipping the rich liquid that tasted of chicken and herbs. The warmth spread through him, chasing away some of the bone-deep chill that had settled in since the shooting. "You haven't asked why I was out in the storm that night," Mae said after a while. Gabriel set down the empty bowl. "I assumed you heard something." "I did, but I could have ignored it, waited until morning." "Sakun." She looked at him directly. "Most people would have in a blizzard like that." "You're not most people." A faint smile touched her lips. "No, I suppose not." She took the bowl from him and returned to the stove. "What will you do now, Mr. Hurst? Your cover is compromised, and at least 2 men know you discovered their secrets." Gabriel considered the question. The original plan had been to gather enough evidence to expose the consortium's illegal activities, then present it to the federal marshals who were investigating similar operations in Colorado and Montana. But that was before he'd been shot, before he'd been forced to reveal his true identity to the one person he had hoped to approach more carefully. "I need to get word to my editor," he said finally, "and I need to find a safe place for the documents I discovered." Mae raised an eyebrow. "You have these documents with you?" "No, I hid them before I was ambushed. They're in a hollow tree near the creek crossing, which means they're still there unless your attackers knew to look for them." Mae frowned. "But retrieving them will have to wait. The snow is too deep, and you're in no condition to travel." Gabriel tried to sit up, only to be forced back by a sharp pain in his chest. "I can't stay here. I've already put you in danger just by being in your home. Mr. Hurst, you have a bullet wound that's barely begun to heal, and we're in the middle of the worst winter in a decade. You're not going anywhere for at least a week, possibly 2. Her tone brooked no argument. "As for danger, I've lived with that since my husband and son died." The blunt statement hung in the air between them. Gabriel had known about Thomas and William Winslow's deaths. It was part of the background information he had gathered before coming to Coleridge, but hearing Mae reference them so directly was unexpected. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, meaning it. Mae's expression remained carefully neutral. "It was a long time ago." But it wasn't, not really. 3 years since Thomas, 2 since William. Grief didn't operate on a tidy schedule, as Gabriel knew all too well. "What happened to them?" he asked gently. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she sighed a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs. Thomas died in a mining accident. A support beam collapsed while he was inspecting a new tunnel. Her voice was flat, reciting facts rather than reliving the event. William fell ill 6 months later. The doctor called it mountain fever, but you didn't believe him, Gabriel finished when she trailed off. May met his gaze steadily. I've seen mountain fever, Mr. Hurst. I've treated it in a dozen miners and their families. What took my son was something else, something that turned his skin yellow and made him waste away over weeks. She paused. Something that began after he drank from Whisper Creek. The implication was clear, and it aligned with what Gabriel had already discovered about the consortium's methods. Buy the land. If the owner refuses, contaminate the water. Wait for sickness or desperation to force a sale at a fraction of the true value. The water survey maps, he said slowly, they don't just show undiscovered aquifers, they show existing water sources that the consortium has deliberately poisoned. May nodded. I've suspected as much for some time. There have been too many illnesses, too many deaths among families whose land adjoins the creek. But suspicion isn't proof, and the local doctor is on the consortium's payroll. Gabriel finished. It was a pattern he had seen repeated in other territories. As is our esteemed sheriff, May added with a hint of bitterness, and the mayor and half the town council. Gabriel thought of the maps hidden near the creek of the names and dates he had recorded in his journal. Evidence that could expose not just corruption, but murder. We need to get that proof to someone who can act on it, he said, before more people die. We, May raised an eyebrow. A moment ago, you were concerned about putting me in danger. Now you're suggesting we work together. You've already been in danger, Gabriel pointed out, since the moment your husband refused to sell your land. He hesitated, then added, and yes, I think we should work together. You know this area, you know the people. And you have a vested interest in seeing justice done. May studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she rose, gathering the empty bowl. Get some rest, Mr. Hurst. We can discuss conspiracies and justice after you've regained some strength. Gabriel wanted to argue to press his case, but exhaustion was rapidly overtaking him, the brief conversation having drained what little energy he had recovered. You still don't trust me, he observed as his eyelids grew heavy. I don't trust anyone, May replied simply. It's how I've stayed alive. As consciousness began to slip away, Gabriel murmured, but you saved me. The last thing he heard before sleep claimed him was May's soft response. Yes, and I'm still trying to understand why. Rebecca Morrison arrived 3 days later, her knock at the door, a rapid, anxious tattoo that instantly put May on alert. Gabriel had been moved to the curtained alcove that usually served as May's sleeping quarters, hidden from casual view. Calvin's been asking questions, Rebecca said as soon as the door closed behind her, about strangers in the area, about who might have come to you for treatment. May kept her expression neutral. No one's come to me except the usual patients. Tom Sanders for his hand, the Peterson boy for his cough. Rebecca's eyes darted around the cabin as if expecting to find evidence contradicting May's claim. He knows May, about the man from the consortium who disappeared. There was blood found near the creek crossing, in tracks leading this way, before the snow covered them. May's heart quickened, but her voice remained steady. Many tracks lead past my cabin, Rebecca. It's on the main trail to the north pastures. This is serious, Rebecca insisted, her voice dropping to a whisper. Calvin isn't just asking as the sheriff. He's asking for them. And they're afraid the man found something important. And what would that be? May asked carefully, maintaining her ignorance. Rebecca glanced toward the window, then back at May. I don't know exactly, but Calvin has been meeting with that man from Denver, the one who runs the regional office. Hargrove. Alexander Hargrove, came a voice from behind the curtain. Rebecca froze, her eyes widening in terror. May, what have you done? May sighed, shooting a reproachful look toward the curtain before turning back to her friend. It's not what you think, Rebecca. You're harboring him, Rebecca said, backing toward the door. If Calvin finds out, he won't, May interrupted, unless someone tells him. The implied question hung in the air between them. Rebecca's hand went to her throat, to the high collar that concealed the latest evidence of her husband's temper. I would never, she whispered, But May, this is dangerous. Not just for you, but for everyone. The consortium has powerful friends all the way to the territorial governor. They're poisoning the water, Rebecca, May said bluntly. They killed my son. Rebecca's face paled. You can't know that for sure. I can with proof. Proof that Mr. Hurst has obtained. Gabriel chose that moment to emerge from behind the curtain, moving slowly to avoid aggravating his wound. He was dressed in a pair of Thomas's old trousers and one of his shirts, both slightly too large for his frame. Despite the civilian clothes and the pallor of his recent injury, there was something unmistakably military in his bearing. Mrs. Morrison, he said, inclining his head in greeting. I apologize for the deception, but it was necessary under the circumstances. Rebecca stared at him, then at May. You said Hurst, but I thought the missing man was named Preston, Nathaniel Preston. An alias, Gabriel explained. I've been investigating the Western Irrigation Consortium for the past year, documenting their illegal activities across 3 territories. As a journalist, May added, though she was beginning to have doubts about that particular claim. There was something in the way Gabriel carried himself, in the precision of his speech, and the calculation in his eyes that suggested a different profession entirely. Rebecca looked between them, confusion and fear warring on her face. I don't understand. Why are you telling me this? Why involve me? Because we need your help, Gabriel said simply, and because your husband is involved in something that goes beyond corruption, something that has led to the deaths of innocent people? The blunt assessment seemed to strike Rebecca like a physical blow. She sank into the nearest chair, her hands trembling slightly. Calvin is many things, she said after a moment, her voice barely audible. But he's not a murderer. May and Gabriel exchanged a glance, a silent communication passing between them, despite their brief acquaintance. Rebecca, May said gently, kneeling beside her friend's chair, I know this is difficult to hear, but the consortium has been systematically poisoning water sources to force landowners to sell. My son died because of their actions, and Thomas's accident at the mine was likely no accident at all. No! Rebecca shook her head, denial etched in every line of her face. Calvin wouldn't be part of that. He couldn't. Perhaps not knowingly, Gabriel suggested, taking a seat across from her. Many of the local officials I've investigated believe they were simply facilitating progress, bringing development to struggling communities. It's possible Sheriff Morrison doesn't fully understand the consortium's methods. It was a diplomatic approach, offering Rebecca a way to reconcile her husband's involvement without accepting his complicity in murder. May recognized the tactic from her own experiences during the war, when soldiers often needed to believe that their actions served a higher purpose even when evidence suggested otherwise. Rebecca seized the lifeline. Yes, that must be it. Calvin talks about progress, about how the consortium will bring jobs and prosperity. He wouldn't knowingly harm anyone. May kept her doubts to herself, remembering the bruises that regularly appeared on Rebecca's skin, the way the sheriff's temper was an open secret in Coleridge. Regardless of what Sheriff Morrison knows or doesn't know, Gabriel said, the fact remains that the consortium is responsible for severe harm to this community, and I have evidence that can expose their actions, evidence that needs to reach the federal authorities in Denver. Sedrenawum, what kind of evidence? Rebecca asked, caution returning to her voice. Water survey maps showing areas the consortium has deliberately contaminated. Financial records documenting payments to local officials who facilitate their land acquisitions. And testimonies from former employees who witnessed the consortium's methods firsthand. Gabriel leaned forward. But the most damning evidence is still hidden near Whisper Creek, where I concealed it before I was attacked. Rebecca's eyes widened. And you want me to help you retrieve it? No, May interjected. That would be too dangerous. But we do need to know if anyone is watching the creek crossing or if Sheriff Morrison has men looking for specific hiding places. Understanding dawned on Rebecca's face. You want me to spy on my husband? We want you to help prevent more deaths, Gabriel corrected gently, including potentially your own. Rebecca looked startled. I'm not a landowner. I have nothing the consortium wants. But you know things, May pointed out. Things that could be dangerous if the wrong people thought you might share them. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but clear. If Calvin Morrison was indeed involved in the consortium's darker activities, And if he suspected his wife knew about them, Rebecca's position was precarious at best. I, Rebecca faltered, then squared her shoulders. What exactly do you need me to do? Gabriel and May exchanged another glance, this one tinged with relief. For now, just listen, Gabriel said. Pay attention to which areas Calvin or his deputies are watching, which names come up in conversation, whether anyone mentions documents or maps. And be careful, May added. Don't ask questions, don't show unusual interest. Just observe. Rebecca nodded slowly. I can do that. She hesitated, then asked, Does Calvin know you're alive, mister? Hurst, does he know you're here? He knows someone was injured near the creek, Gabriel answered, but he doesn't know who or where. He paused. At least I hope he doesn't. The doubt in his voice made May glance at him sharply. There was something he wasn't saying, something beyond his concern for their immediate safety. Before she could question it, Rebecca rose. I should go. Calvin will be expecting me home. She gathered her shawl, then turned to May. Be careful, both of you. The consortium's people aren't the only danger in Coleridge. After Rebecca had gone, May turned to Gabriel, who had sunk back into his chair, clearly exhausted by even this brief conversation. You should be resting, she said, noticing the pallor that had returned to his face. There isn't time, he replied, though he made no move to stand. If Morrison is asking questions about me specifically, it means the consortium knows what I found. They'll be looking for those documents. And they won't find them until the snow melts enough for us to retrieve them ourselves, May pointed out, which gives you time to recover your strength. Gabriel shook his head. You don't understand. The maps are only part of it. There's a journal with names, dates, details of transactions. If they find it, then many powerful men would face consequences for their actions, May finished, including potentially whoever shot you. Yes, Gabriel looked at her intently, but also including people who have nothing to do with the consortium, people whose safety depends on that journal remaining hidden. There it was again, that sense that Gabriel was holding something back. May studied him, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his hands had curled into fists on the armrests of his chair. Who are you really, Mr. Hurst? She asked quietly. And don't tell me you're a journalist. I've treated enough soldiers to recognize a man trained for combat, and enough lawmen to know one when I see one. Gabriel held her gaze for a long moment, weighing options she could almost see cycling through his mind. Finally, he sighed. My name is Gabriel Hurst, he said. That much is true, but I'm not a journalist. He paused. I work for the Pinkerton Detective Agency, contracted by the Department of Justice to investigate the Western Irrigation Consortium's activities across the Western Territories. The admission didn't surprise May as much as it might have. It explained his bearing, his methodical approach to gathering evidence, the old scars that spoke of previous dangerous assignments. And the photograph? She asked, circling back to the detail that still bothered her. Was that part of your cover as well? A shadow passed over Gabriel's face. No, that was personal. May waited, sensing there was more to the story. Gabriel looked away toward the window where snow continued to fall in a gentle curtain. You saved my life at Antietam, as I told you. That part was true, but it wasn't just my life. He hesitated. My sister Amelia was a nurse in the same field hospital. You worked together for 3 months in the summer of '62. Salcum. The name struck a chord in May's memory. Amelia Hurst, a quiet, efficient young woman with the same gray eyes as her brother. They had indeed worked together, treating the endless stream of wounded from the Maryland and Virginia campaigns. I remember her, May said slowly. She was good, steady hands, didn't flinch at the worst wounds. A thought occurred to her. But I don't recall saying goodbye. She must have been transferred to another unit. She wasn't transferred, Gabriel said, his voice tight. She was killed when Confederate artillery hit the hospital tent during the Battle of Fredericksburg. You were away retrieving supplies from the main depot. The news hit May like a physical blow. So many had died during the war, so many faces had blurred together in her memory. But she remembered Amelia, remembered her kindness to the soldiers, her quiet competence, her rare smile. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it. I didn't know. Gabriel nodded, accepting her words. After I recovered from my wound, I tried to find her. When I learned what had happened, He trailed off, then continued. I made a promise to myself that I would find a way to honor her memory. She joined the nursing corps because she believed in helping others and standing against injustice. So you became a detective, Mae said, understanding dawning. Fighting injustice in your own way. Yes, Gabriel looked at her directly. And when this investigation led me to Coleridge to Whisper Creek, and I discovered that you, the woman who saved my life, who worked alongside my sister, were here, it seemed like. He hesitated. Providence, Mae suggested with just a hint of the bitterness that had colored her earlier reference to God. Or coincidence, Gabriel acknowledged. But either way, it felt significant, as if Amelia had led me here to finish what the consortium started when they poisoned your son's water. The raw honesty in his voice resonated with something in Mae, some echo of the faith she had once held before loss had hollowed it out of her. She didn't believe in divine intervention, not anymore, but she did believe in connections and the invisible threads that bound people together through shared experiences, shared pain. Your sister was a good woman, she said finally. She would be proud of what you're trying to do. Gabriel's expression softened slightly. Thank you. He shifted in his chair, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing wound. But sentiment won't retrieve those documents or bring the consortium to justice. We need a plan. Mae was about to respond when a sound outside caught her attention, the crunch of snow under boots approaching the cabin. She moved swiftly to the window, peering out through a gap in the curtains. Sheriff Calvin Morrison stood in her yard, flanked by 2 deputies, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. It seems we've run out of time for planning, Mae said quietly. Sheriff Morrison is here. Gabriel tried to rise, but Mae pressed him back into the chair with a firm hand on his shoulder. You're in no condition to run in hiding. You will only confirm his suspicions. She straightened, smoothing her skirt and adjusting her collar. Let me handle this. Honey. Before Gabriel could protest, Mae had crossed to the door, composing her features into a mask of mild curiosity as she opened it to face the law of Coleridge. Sheriff, she greeted him, her voice cool but polite. What brings you out in this weather? Calvin Morrison was a tall man with a thick mustache and the beginning of a paunch that strained against his winter coat. His eyes, small and shrewd, took in Mae's composed expression before sliding past her to survey what was visible of the cabin's interior. Dr. Winslow, he said, the title carrying a faint note of mockery. I'm conducting an investigation. Mind if we come in? It wasn't really a question, and they both knew it. Mae stepped aside, allowing Morrison and his deputies to enter, their heavy boots tracking snow onto her clean floor. Morrison's gaze immediately locked onto Gabriel, who remained seated by the fire. And who might this be? This is Mr. Hurst, Mae said calmly. He was caught in the blizzard last week and suffered frostbite. I've been treating him. Gabriel nodded in greeting, his expression carefully neutral. Sheriff. Morrison's eyes narrowed. Caught in the blizzard, you say, long way from anywhere to be traveling in such weather. I was on my way to Casper, Gabriel replied. Business with the railroad. Took a wrong turn when the storm hit. Railroad business, Morrison repeated, skepticism evident in his tone. Interesting. We don't get many railroad men through Coleridge. I'm an investor, not an employee, Gabriel clarified smoothly, looking at potential spur lines to connect mining operations to the main tracks. Morrison circled the room slowly, his gaze taking in details: the medical texts on the shelves, the curtained alcove, the neat stack of bandages on the table near Gabriel. Frostbite, you said, he asked, turning back to Mae. Yes, fortunately mild, but it required immediate treatment. Morrison stepped closer to Gabriel, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. Funny thing, frostbite. Doesn't usually bleed. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted instantly, tension crackling like static before a lightning strike. I'm not sure what you mean, Sheriff, Mae said, keeping her voice level. I mean, Morrison said, his eyes never leaving Gabriel, that we found blood near the creek crossing, quite a lot of it, and tracks leading in this direction before the snow covered them. Gabriel met the sheriff's gaze steadily. Perhaps someone was hunting. A wounded deer could leave such a trail. Ishtam, perhaps, Morrison agreed. Or perhaps someone who didn't belong here got himself into trouble. Someone like, say, Nathaniel Preston. The name hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Mae felt her pulse quicken, but kept her expression neutral, waiting to see how Gabriel would respond. I don't know anyone by that name, Gabriel said after a calculated pause. Though if he was out in that blizzard, I hope he found shelter as I did. Morrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. Interesting you should say that, because Mr. Preston was expected at a meeting in Casper 3 days ago. Important meeting with some very influential people. But he never arrived. The sheriff leaned closer. And now I find a stranger in Dr. Winslow's cabin claiming to be heading to the very place Preston was supposed to go. Gabriel spread his hands in a gesture of innocence. A coincidence, I assure you, though I'm sorry to hear about this, Mr. Preston. Perhaps when the weather clears, you could organize a search party. Mae watched the exchange with growing unease. Morrison wasn't buying their story, that much was clear, and his next move would depend on how much he already knew or suspected about Gabriel's true identity. Sheriff, she interjected, Mr. Hurst is still recovering. If you have official questions for him, perhaps they could wait until he's stronger. Morrison turned his attention to Mae, his gaze sharpening. Always looking out for others, aren't you, Dr. Winslow? Just like you looked out for your husband and son. He stepped toward her. Curious how you never seemed to question their deaths, never pushed for more thorough investigations. The implied accusation struck Mae like a slap, but she held her ground. There was nothing to investigate. The mine's own safety inspector confirmed the accident that killed Thomas, and Dr. Lewis diagnosed William's illness. Yes, very neat explanations. Morrison smiled thinly. Almost as neat as your explanation for this stranger's presence. He glanced at Gabriel again. Railroad investor with frostbite just happening to appear during the worst blizzard in years, right when a consortium representative goes missing. Mae felt the situation slipping away from her, the carefully constructed facade crumbling under Morrison's probing. She opened her mouth to respond, but Gabriel spoke first. You seem very concerned about this Preston fellow, Sheriff, he observed. Was he a friend of yours? Morrison's jaw tightened. Just doing my job, Mr. Hurst. When people go missing in my jurisdiction, I take notice. Even if they're just passing through, Gabriel pressed. Or do you have a special interest in the Western Irrigation Consortium and its employees? The question was a calculated risk. Mae realized a direct challenge that might reveal how deeply Morrison was involved with the consortium's activities. The sheriff's hand tightened on his revolver, but his voice remained controlled. I have an interest in maintaining order in Coleridge, and in ensuring that everyone respects the law. He turned to his deputies. Search the cabin. Thoroughly. Mae stepped forward. You have no right. I have every right, Morrison cut her off. When I suspect a crime has been committed, he pulled a piece of paper from his coat. This is a warrant signed by Judge Wilson authorizing the search of any property where Nathaniel Preston might be found, or where evidence related to his disappearance might be concealed. Mae scanned the document quickly. It was indeed a warrant, though the language was broad enough to justify virtually any intrusion. This is harassment, she said, anger slipping into her voice despite her efforts to remain calm. This is the law, Dr. Winslow. Morrison's smile was cold. Something you'd do well to remember. The deputies began their search, opening cabinets, looking under furniture, rifling through the carefully organized shelves. One pulled back the curtain to the alcove, examining the bed where Gabriel had been hidden earlier. Mae stood rigid, watching as they dismantled the order of her home. Gabriel remained seated, his expression neutral, though she could see the tension in his shoulders, the calculation in his eyes as he tracked the deputies' movements. Sheriff, one of the men called, emerging from behind the curtain. Found this under the bed. He held up Gabriel's ruined coat, the dark stain of dried blood clearly visible on the front. Morrison took the coat, examining it with a grim satisfaction before turning to Gabriel. Interesting souvenir for a man with frostbite, Mr. Hurst. Gabriel's expression didn't change. As I said, I was caught in the blizzard. My horse threw me before finding its way to Dr. Winslow's cabin. I suffered some injuries in the fall, which the doctor treated along with the frostbite. A fall that just happened to tear your coat in a pattern remarkably similar to a bullet hole, Morrison observed dryly. I landed on a broken branch, Gabriel countered smoothly. The wound was jagged, as Dr. Winslow can confirm. Mae nodded seamlessly, aligning her story with his. The injury required several stitches, but was more dramatic in appearance than in severity. Morrison looked between them, skepticism etched in every line of his face. But before he could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention, the sound of galloping hooves approaching at speed. One of the deputies moved to the window. "Rider coming fast, Sheriff. Looks like Thompson from the telegraph office." Morrison frowned, then strode to the door, opening it just as a young man reined his horse to a stop in front of the cabin. "Sheriff," the rider called, breathless. "Urgent message from Denver. Federal marshals are on their way to Coleridge. Something about an investigation into the irrigation consortium." May felt a surge of hope, quickly tempered by caution. Federal involvement could change everything, or it could force Morrison and his consortium allies to take more desperate measures. The sheriff's expression darkened. "When are they expected?" "Day after tomorrow, weather permitting," Thompson replied. "The telegram says they're bringing warrants for several arrests." Morrison was silent for a moment, his mind clearly working through the implications. Then he turned back to the cabin, his gaze finding Gabriel. "Interesting timing," he said softly. "Almost as if someone sent for them." His eyes narrowed. "Or as if someone knew they were coming." Gabriel met his gaze steadily. "As interesting as a sheriff's unusual concern for a missing businessman." The challenge in the words was unmistakable. For a tense moment, May thought Morrison might draw his weapon, might abandon pretense entirely, and take the direct approach to silencing a threat. Instead, he turned to his deputies. "We're done here. For now." He looked at May. "Consider yourself fortunate, Dr. Winslow. We'll continue this conversation after I've dealt with our federal visitors." As Morrison and his men mounted their horses, the sheriff paused, turning back to fix Gabriel with a hard stare. "I don't know who you really are, Mr. Hurst, but I know you're not what you claim. And when I prove it, neither you nor your protector will find Coleridge a hospitable place." With that parting threat, he spurred his horse toward town, his deputies following close behind. May watched until they disappeared from sight, then closed the door, leaning against it as the tension of the encounter drained from her body. "That was too close," she said quietly. Gabriel nodded, his own posture relaxing slightly. "He knows. Not everything, but enough to be dangerous. And now he knows the marshals are coming." May pushed away from the door, moving to stoke the fire that had burned low during the confrontation. "Which means we have less than 2 days to retrieve your evidence and get it to them." Gabriel raised an eyebrow. "A moment ago, you were insisting I rest and recover. That was before the sheriff made it clear that he considers me complicit in whatever he believes you've done." May straightened, meeting his gaze. "I made my choice when I brought you into my home, Mr. Hurst. I might as well see it through." Gabriel studied her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in his gray eyes. "You're risking everything," he said finally. "Your home, your practice, your safety." May thought of her son wasting away in the bed where Gabriel now slept, of her husband buried in a closed casket because the accident had left his face unrecognizable, of the creek that had once been a source of life and was now a carrier of death. "I have less to lose than you might think," she said, "and more reason to want justice than most." Gabriel nodded slowly, accepting her resolve. "Then we need a plan. Morrison will be watching the creek crossing and probably my hiding place if he's guessed where the documents might be." "We don't go to the crossing," May said, already thinking ahead. "There's another way to reach that part of the creek, a deer trail that runs behind the old McAllister place. It's longer, but less obvious." "And if Morrison has men watching that too?" May moved to a cabinet, retrieving Thomas's revolver and checking that it was loaded. "Then we deal with that when we come to it." The decisiveness in her voice seemed to surprise Gabriel, and perhaps May realized it surprised her as well. The woman who had arrived in Coleridge 3 years ago, grieving and defeated, would never have contemplated defying the sheriff or risking what little she had left for a cause that might be hopeless. But that woman had died with her son, replaced by someone harder. Someone who recognized that justice sometimes required sacrifice. "We'll leave at first light," she said, tucking the revolver into the pocket of her skirt. "The snow should provide enough cover if we're careful." Gabriel nodded, his expression solemn. "First light," he agreed. "And May—" He hesitated, then continued. "Thank you. Not just for saving my life, but for believing in what I'm trying to do." Sukakim May looked at him, at this man who carried her photograph, who had lost a sister to the same war that had forged her, who was willing to risk his life to expose a truth that most would prefer to leave buried. "I believe in justice, Mr. Hurst," she said simply. "It's been in short supply around Whisper Creek. As she turned away to prepare for their journey, May felt something stirring within her, something she had thought long dead buried alongside William and Thomas in the cemetery on the hill. Hope, fragile and tentative, but unmistakable. And with it came the cold, clear certainty that before justice could be served, more blood would be shed along the banks of Whisper Creek. Dawn came slowly to Whisper Creek, the gray light seeping through clouds heavy with the promise of more snow. May stood at her cabin window watching as the world gradually emerged from darkness. Behind her, Gabriel meticulously checked the revolver she had given him, his movements, betraying years of practice. "The creek will be partially frozen," May said, not turning from the window. "Thin ice near the edges, open water in the center, where the current is strongest." "How far to the crossing?" Gabriel asked, tucking the weapon into his coat, one of Thomas's old hunting jackets that May had pulled from a trunk the night before. 2 miles following the deer trail. It's not an easy path, even in good weather." She finally turned to face him. "Are you certain you're strong enough for this?" Gabriel met her gaze steadily. "I don't have the luxury of waiting until I'm fully recovered." May nodded, accepting his assessment. She had spent the early hours of the morning gathering supplies, bandages in case Gabriel's wound reopened, food, wrapped in oilcloth, matches, and the small flask of whiskey she kept for medicinal purposes. "We should move while it's still early," she said, packing the last items into a canvas satchel. "Morrison will have men watching the main trails, but they may not be in position yet. Most of his deputies aren't fond of pre-dawn patrols, especially in this cold." "Master." Gabriel stood wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his healing wound. "You know the sheriff's men well." "I've treated most of them at one time or another," May replied. "Occupational hazard in a small town, you learn everyone's habits whether you want to or not." She donned her heavy wool coat and wrapped a scarf around her neck, then checked that Thomas's revolver was secure in her pocket. The weight of it was familiar, comforting in a way that reminded her of her husband's solid presence. "Ready?" she asked. Gabriel nodded, his gray eyes clear and focused, despite the pallor that still clung to his features. "Lead the way, Doctor." They left the cabin through the back door, keeping to the tree line where their tracks would be less visible. The snow was deep but passable, compacting beneath their boots with a soft crunch that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness of the morning. May set a deliberate pace, mindful of Gabriel's condition and of the need to move quietly. They skirted the edge of what had once been the McAllister farm, now abandoned after the family had sold to the consortium and moved east. The old cabin still stood, its windows dark and empty, a single tendril of smoke rising from the chimney. "Someone's there," Gabriel murmured, nodding toward the smoke. "Probably just travelers using it for shelter." May replied, though she unconsciously rested her hand on the revolver in her pocket. "The consortium hasn't done anything with the property yet, and Morrison generally looks the other way when people take temporary refuge." They gave the cabin a wide berth, nonetheless, following a barely visible path that wound through a stand of pines before descending toward the creek. The terrain grew steeper, forcing them to proceed with caution on the slippery ground. As they emerged from the trees, Whisper Creek lay before them, a dark ribbon cutting through the white landscape. Just as May had predicted, ice had formed along the edges, but the center remained open, the water moving swiftly over rocks barely visible beneath the surface. "There," Gabriel said, pointing to a massive oak that stood sentinel on the opposite bank. "The hollow is on the creek side, about 4 feet up from the base." May studied the creek, calculating the best crossing point. "The water's too deep here. We need to move upstream where it's shallower." They followed the bank for another quarter-mile, the only sounds the rush of water and the occasional call of a winter bird. Finally, May spotted what she was looking for, a series of large stones breaking the surface of the creek, creating a natural, if precarious, pathway across. "We can cross here," she said, testing the first stone with her foot to ensure it was stable. "Follow exactly where I step. The rocks can be slippery." She moved with the confidence of someone who had made this crossing many times before, her body remembering the path even as her mind remained alert for dangers beyond the creek. Gabriel followed more cautiously, his movements hampered by his injury. Halfway across, as May balanced on a flat stone near the center of the creek, a sound reached her, faint but unmistakable. The whinny of a horse somewhere upstream. She raised her hand, signaling Gabriel to stop. They stood motionless, water rushing past mere inches below their feet as May strained to hear over the sound of the current. There it was again, and with it the murmur of men's voices. "Morrison's men," she whispered, turning carefully to face Gabriel. "At least two, maybe more upstream near the main crossing." Gabriel nodded, his expression grim. "Can they see us from there?" Mae glanced in the direction of the sounds. "Not if we stay low. There's a bend in the creek between us and them." They continued across with renewed urgency, each step measured but quick. As they reached the far bank, Gabriel stumbled slightly, his boots slipping on the icy stone. Mae caught his arm, steadying him before he could fall into the freezing water. "Thank you," he murmured, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. Mae nodded, her hand lingering on his arm a moment longer than necessary before she released him. "The oak is this way," she said, turning upstream. They moved along the bank, keeping to the shelter of the trees until the massive oak came into view. Its bare branches reached toward the sky like arthritic fingers, its trunk so wide that two people could not have encircled it with their arms. Gabriel approached the tree, running his hand along the rough bark until he found what he was looking for. A hollow partially concealed by a growth of moss exactly where he had described it. "Keep watch," he said quietly, reaching into the hollow. Mae positioned herself where she could see both upstream and downstream, her hand on the revolver. The voices they had heard earlier were gone now, but that didn't mean Morrison's men had left the area. After a moment, Gabriel withdrew his hand, clutching a small oilskin package. "Got it," he said, relief evident in his voice. As he tucked the package inside his coat, a twig snapped in the woods behind them. Mae turned sharply, drawing the revolver in one fluid motion. A figure stood among the trees, partially obscured by the trunk of a pine. For a heartbeat, Mae kept the revolver trained on the shadow, her finger tense on the trigger. Then the figure stepped forward and Mae felt her breath catch. "Rebecca?" She lowered the gun slightly. "What are you doing here?" Rebecca Morrison emerged fully from the trees, her face pale beneath her woolen hood. "I came to warn you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Calvin knows about the documents. He sent men to search along the creek at first light." Gabriel moved to stand beside Mae, his body tense. "How did he know?" Rebecca's eyes darted to his face, then away. "There was a telegram late last night. From Denver. From someone named Hargrove." She swallowed. "Calvin was upset. He said someone had betrayed them, that the federal investigation was because of leaked documents." Mae and Gabriel exchanged a glance. Alexander Hargrove, the consortium's regional director, the man whose name Gabriel had spoken when Rebecca first visited the cabin. "Did you follow us here?" Mae asked, a note of suspicion entering her voice despite herself. Rebecca shook her head. "I went to your cabin when Calvin left this morning. When you weren't there, I guessed you might have come to the creek." Her gaze shifted to the oilskin package, visible in Gabriel's partially buttoned coat. "You found what you were looking for." It wasn't a question, but Gabriel nodded. "Evidence that the consortium has been poisoning water sources, including Whisper Creek." Something flickered in Rebecca's eyes, relief perhaps, or fear. Mae couldn't be certain. "You need to hurry," Rebecca said. "Calvin's men are searching every inch of the creek. They'll find you soon if you don't move." "Come with us," Mae urged, suddenly reluctant to leave her friend behind. "If Morrison suspects you helped us," Rebecca shook her head again. "I can't. Cal would know I was involved for certain then. This way I can say I was gathering herbs or visiting the McAllister place to check if travelers needed medical attention." She managed a wan smile. "I've learned to lie convincingly over the years." The sad truth in those words struck Mae like a physical blow. How many lies had Rebecca told to protect herself from her husband's temper? How many excuses had she crafted for bruises and broken possessions? "Rebecca?" Mae began, but was cut off by the distant sound of voices closer now than before. "Go," Rebecca insisted. "I'll head toward the McAllister cabin. Make noise, draw them in that direction." Gabriel looked at her intently. "You're taking a significant risk, Mrs. Morrison." "I've been taking risks since the day I married Calvin," Rebecca replied with a bitter smile. "At least this one might help someone, besides myself." She turned to Mae. "Be careful, both of you." Before Mae could respond, Rebecca had turned and was moving through the trees toward the abandoned cabin, deliberately making more noise than necessary as she went. "We need to move," Gabriel said softly. "Downstream, away from the search party." "How on?" Mae nodded, tucking the revolver back into her pocket. "There's an old trapper's cabin about a mile south. We can shelter there until it's safe to return. They set off through the woods, moving as quickly as Gabriel's condition would allow. The morning was advancing, the gray light strengthening, making their tracks in the snow more visible. Mae led them on a circuitous route, doubling back occasionally and walking along fallen logs where possible to confuse any pursuers. The trapper's cabin was little more than a shack, half collapsed on one side, where snow had caved in the roof years before. But the other half remained relatively intact, with walls that would block the wind and enough space for two people to wait out the day. "It's not much," Mae said as they ducked through the low doorway, "but it's out of sight and no one comes here anymore, since old Jedediah passed on." Honors, Gabriel moved to the single window, its glass long gone, and peered out at the woods they had just traversed. "No sign of pursuit yet," he said. "Your friend's distraction may have worked." Mae brushed snow from a rough-hewn bench and sat down suddenly, aware of the ache in her legs from the long trek through deep snow. "Rebecca is braver than most people realize," she said quietly, "including herself." Gabriel turned from the window, studying her face. "You've been friends a long time." "Sorry, since the war," Mae confirmed. "We served in the same field hospitals for over a year." She was younger then, full of idealism about helping the wounded, making a difference. She sighed. "Calvin Morrison changed that." "How did she come to marry him?" Gabriel asked, taking a seat on a crate across from her. Mae's expression darkened. "He wasn't always what he is now, or at least he hid it better. He was a cavalry officer, seemed honorable enough. They met when he was recovering from a minor wound at our hospital." She paused. "After the war, when Rebecca had nowhere to go, her family had died in a fire while she was serving, he offered marriage and a home in the West. It seemed like Providence at the time. And by the time she understood what kind of man he truly was, it was too late." Gabriel finished. "Yes." Mae looked away toward the broken roof where snowflakes drifted in. "Too late for many things." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the soft whistle of wind through the cabin's many gaps. Finally, Gabriel spoke again. "The documents we retrieved, they prove more than water poisoning. They show a systematic conspiracy involving officials at every level, from local sheriffs to territorial judges." He pulled the oilskin package from his coat. "Names, dates, amounts paid for cooperation. It's enough to bring down not just the Western Irrigation Consortium, but many of the so-called respectable men who've profited from their methods." Mae watched as he carefully unwrapped the package, revealing a leather-bound journal and several folded maps. "Including Calvin Morrison." "Yes." Gabriel confirmed, opening the journal to a marked page. "He's been on their payroll for nearly 4 years, since shortly after he became sheriff of Coleridge." The timing sent a chill through Mae that had nothing to do with the drafty cabin. 4 years. That's when Thomas died. Gabriel looked up sharply. "Your husband—" Mae nodded, her face expressionless, though her hands had clenched into fists in her lap. "The accident at the mine happened 3 months after Morrison was elected sheriff. Thomas had been arguing with the mine owner about safety conditions, threatening to organize the other workers if changes weren't made. And the mine owner was connected to the consortium," Gabriel said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Jasper Holloway." Mae's voice was flat. "He sold the mine to the consortium a year after Thomas died, then moved to Denver to sit on their board of directors." Gabriel turned pages in the journal until he found what he was searching for. "Here," he said, holding the book out to Mae. "September 12th, 1869. Payment to Sheriff C. Morrison $500 for resolution of labor difficulties at the Coleridge Silver Mine." Mae took the journal with hands that suddenly trembled. The neat handwriting, the precise amount, the euphemistic description of what must have been her husband's murder, it was all there in black ink, undeniable. "They killed him," she said softly, "and Morrison helped them cover it up." "Yes." Gabriel's voice was gentle but firm. "And they've done the same to others across 3 territories, anyone who stood in the way of their water acquisitions or who threatened to expose their methods." Mae continued to stare at the journal, at the damning evidence that confirmed what she had suspected for years but had been unable to prove. When she finally looked up, her eyes were dry, her expression resolute. "What about William?" "My son." Gabriel hesitated, then turned to another section of the journal. "There are records here of selective water management, their term for deliberate contamination of specific water sources." He found the page he was looking for. This entry mentions Whisper Creek, dated April 1870, with a note about encouraging compliance from remaining independent landholders. The date was 2 weeks before William had fallen ill. May closed her eyes, briefly absorbing this final confirmation of the consortium's responsibility for her son's death. "They poisoned him," she said when she opened her eyes again. "A 7-year-old boy who never harmed anyone, who loved that creek and the creatures that lived in it." Her voice remained steady, though a muscle twitched in her jaw. "And they did it because I refused to sell our land after Thomas died. The land that contains the creek's headwaters," Gabriel said, understanding the strategic value of May's small property. "Control that, and they control all the water downstream." "Yes." And May handed the journal back to him. "Thomas always said our little claim was worth more than it appeared. He chose it specifically for the springs that feed the creek." Gabriel rewrapped the journal and maps, carefully securing the package inside his coat. "These documents will ensure the consortium faces justice for what they've done to your family and to many others." May nodded, though a part of her wondered what justice truly meant in the face of such losses. Would prosecuting the men responsible bring back Thomas's laugh or William's curious mind? Would it restore the years of solitude she had endured, thinking herself simply unlucky rather than targeted? "We should rest while we can," she said, pushing these thoughts aside. "It's a long journey back to the cabin, and we'll need to travel after dark to avoid Morrison's men." Gabriel agreed, settling himself as comfortably as possible on the hard crate. His face was drawn with fatigue, the exertion of their morning journey clearly taking a toll on his still healing body. "Try to sleep," May told him. "I'll keep watch." As Gabriel closed his eyes, May moved to the window, gazing out at the silent woods. Snow had begun to fall more heavily, erasing their tracks and cloaking the world in white. It would make travel more difficult later, but for now it provided an additional layer of protection from pursuit. Her mind returned to the journal entries, to the cold, calculating way her family's deaths had been documented as business expenses. Rage simmered beneath her composed exterior, a feeling she had suppressed for years in favor of survival. But now, with evidence in hand and federal marshals on their way to Coleridge, perhaps she could finally allow herself to feel the full measure of her anger and to channel it toward justice. Tumiyuan. The day passed slowly, marked by the gradual shift of shadows across the cabin floor. May and Gabriel took turns keeping watch, speaking little, but sharing the food she had packed and the warmth of the small fire they risked building in what remained of the old stone hearth. As dusk approached, May studied the sky through the broken roof. "The snow's stopping," she observed. "We should be able to travel once it's fully dark." Gabriel nodded, joining her at the window. "Morrison's men may still be searching." "Likely not after nightfall," May replied. "Most of his deputies are townsmen, not trackers. They'll return to Coleridge for the night, perhaps resume the search tomorrow." "Unless Morrison himself leads them," Gabriel said. "He has more at stake than most." May considered this. Possible, but unlikely. Calvin prefers to direct rather than participate, especially in weather like this. She remembered Rebecca's words about her husband's habits shared during late-night conversations when she sought refuge at May's cabin. "He'll be at the Cattlemen's Association tonight, maintaining his public persona while his men do the difficult work." The last light was fading when they finally left the trapper's cabin, moving through deepening shadows back toward Whisper Creek. The fresh snow made the going difficult, but it also muffled their footsteps and covered any tracks almost as soon as they were made. They crossed the creek at a different point than before, where the water ran shallow over a gravel bed. The cold bit through May's boots as they waded across, but the crossing was swift and, more importantly, silent. The route back to her cabin was longer than their morning journey, as May deliberately avoided both the main trails and the areas where Morrison's men were most likely to be watching. They skirted the edge of town, keeping to the shadows of barns and outbuildings when they needed to cross open spaces. It was well past midnight when they finally approached the cabin. No lights burned within, and no horses were visible nearby, good signs that Morrison had not stationed men to wait for their return. Still, May insisted on caution. "Wait here," she whispered, gesturing for Gabriel to remain in the shelter of the trees. "I'll make sure it's safe." Before he could protest, she had moved silently toward the cabin, keeping low and using the shadows for cover. She circled the building completely before approaching the door, checking for any sign that someone had been there in their absence. The door was, as she had left it, the thin thread she had stretched across the bottom, still intact, a simple trick she had learned during the war to detect intruders. She entered cautiously nonetheless, waiting for her eyes to adjust to the deeper darkness inside before moving to light a lamp. The cabin appeared undisturbed. Mae checked her hiding places, the loose floorboard beneath the bed, the hollow space behind the pantry shelf, finding everything as it should be. Only then did she return to the door and signal for Gabriel to join her. "All clear," she said as he entered, closing and bolting the door behind him. "They haven't been here." Gabriel sank into a chair, the strain of the day's journey evident in the lines of his face. "Good," he said, though his voice lacked strength. "We need to keep the documents safe until the marshals arrive tomorrow." Mae lit a fire in the hearth, then moved to examine Gabriel's wound. The exertion had taken a toll. A small spot of blood had seeped through his bandages, staining Thomas's old shirt. "You've torn some stitches," she said, her professional demeanor asserting itself. "I need to check the wound and rebandage it." Gabriel didn't argue, allowing her to help him remove the coat and shirt. As she worked cleaning the reopened section of the wound and applying fresh bandages, a comfortable silence settled between them. It was in this silence, as Mae's practiced hands moved gently across his injured flesh, that Gabriel spoke words that shifted the ground beneath her feet. "I didn't tell you everything," he said quietly. "About why I came to Coleridge, why I had your photograph." Mae's hands stilled momentarily before resuming their work. "I gathered as much," she replied, keeping her voice neutral. Gabriel took a deep breath. "Your son, William," he said. "He wasn't just another victim of the consortium's methods. He hesitated. "He was my nephew." Mae froze, her mind struggling to make sense of his words. "What? Amelia, my sister, she had a child before the war. A boy she gave to a couple unable to have children of their own." Gabriel's voice was steady, though his eyes betrayed the emotional weight of this revelation. "Thomas Winslow and his wife, who later died in childbirth." The world seemed to tilt around Mae as the implications of Gabriel's words sank in. William, her bright, curious boy with eyes that had always reminded her of someone she couldn't quite place, had been Amelia Hearst's child. "How can you possibly know this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Amelia told me before she died at Fredericksburg," Gabriel replied. "She made me promise to find her son someday, to make sure he was safe and loved." His eyes met Mae's. "I tracked Thomas Winslow after the war, learned he had remarried to you, and that you were raising the boy as your own." Onanam, Mae's mind flooded with memories of Thomas's careful explanation when they first met, that he had a young son whose mother had died, of William's gray eyes so like the ones now watching her with apprehension, of the strange feeling of connection she had experienced when she first saw Gabriel in the snow. "Why didn't you come forward then?" she asked. "Why wait all these years?" "I did come to Coleridge 3 years ago," Gabriel admitted, "but by then Thomas had died in the mine accident. You were struggling to hold on to your land to care for William on your own. I thought," he looked away, "I thought my presence would only complicate your lives further. So I watched from a distance, made sure you had what you needed when I could arrange it anonymously." A puzzle piece clicked into place in Mae's mind. "The money that appeared when the roof needed repair," she said slowly. "The medical supplies that arrived from Denver when my own stocks were depleted." Gabriel nodded. "Small things, nothing that would raise suspicion." "And then William died," Mae said, the words hollow in her throat. "Yes." Gabriel's voice tightened. "I was in Montana on another assignment when it happened. By the time I received word and returned, he was already buried beside Thomas. That's when I began investigating the consortium in earnest, suspecting William's death wasn't natural." Mae sat back, overwhelmed by these revelations. The boy she had loved as her own, whom she had nursed through childhood illnesses and taught to read by lamplight, had been connected to her even before she met Thomas, through Amelia, through the war that had shaped all their lives. "Why tell me now?" she asked finally. Gabriel held her gaze steadily. "Because the marshals arriving tomorrow might reveal my true identity regardless. Because you deserve to know the full truth before we face whatever comes next. And because," he hesitated, "because William was the last connection between us and Amelia, and now that he's gone, the truth is all we have left of her." Mae absorbed his words, feeling the weight of them settle around her heart. The loss of William had been devastating. Learning now of this hidden connection made it both more painful and somehow more significant. "The consortium didn't just take my husband and son," she said after a long moment. They took your sister's child, your nephew. Gabriel nodded, his expression grave. Which is why I won't rest until they're held accountable. Not just for William, but for all the lives they've destroyed in their pursuit of power and wealth. As the fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the cabin walls, May felt something shift within her, a realignment of her understanding of the past 3 years of her place in a story larger and more complex than she had realized. Neither will I, she said quietly, her voice firm, despite the emotion constricting her throat. Whatever it takes, whatever comes next, they will answer for what they've done. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent in the deep of night. Within the cabin, two people bound by loss and blood contemplated a future suddenly uncertain, yet more purposeful than either had dared hope for in years. The reckoning was coming, and with it perhaps a measure of the justice they both sought. Dawn found May standing at her cabin window once more, watching as the world emerged from darkness. Behind her, Gabriel slept fitfully, his body finally succumbing to exhaustion after their arduous journey and the emotional weight of his confession about William. The revelation had kept May awake through what remained of the night, her mind sifting through memories of the boy she had loved as her own, searching for signs she might have missed. William's gray eyes, so like Gabriel's, so like Amelia's, had always seemed familiar in a way she couldn't quite place. Now she understood why. The federal marshals would arrive today, weather permitting. Justice so long deferred was finally within reach. Yet May felt strangely hollow, as if the confirmation of her suspicions had carved something essential from her core. A sound from the bed drew her attention. Gabriel was awake, watching her with those Hearst eyes that had passed unknowingly to her son. "How long have you been standing there?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "A while," May replied. "The marshals should reach Coleridge by noon if the pass is clear." Gabriel sat up carefully, mindful of his wound. "And if it isn't, then we have a decision to make." May turned back to the window. "Morrison knows we have the documents. He won't wait patiently for federal intervention." "No," Gabriel agreed. "He won't." The simplicity of the exchange belied the complexity of their situation. If the marshals were delayed, Morrison and his consortium allies would move against them. The evidence they possessed threatened not only careers, but freedom, the kind of threat desperate men would kill to eliminate. "We should eat," May said, moving to stoke the fire and put water on to boil. "Gather our strength while we can." Surman. As she prepared a simple meal of cornmeal porridge and the last of her preserved apples, Gabriel studied the journal they had retrieved, noting specific passages that would be most damning to Morrison and the consortium leadership. "There's enough here to indict at least 12 officials," he said, "including Judge Wilson, who signed Morrison's search warrant." "And Hargrove?" May asked, setting a bowl before him. "The regional director?" Gabriel nodded. "Hargrove authorized the water management program, their euphemism for poisoning. His signature is on half a dozen directives." May sat across from him, her own bowl untouched. "What about whoever shot you? Is there evidence of who that might have been?" "Not directly," Gabriel admitted, "but there's a list of field operators employed for special tasks. 2 names are associated with this region, men identified only as Fallon and Webb." The names meant nothing to May, but the implication was clear. The consortium employed professional gunmen to eliminate problems that couldn't be solved through bribery or intimidation. "Eat," she urged, noting that Gabriel had set aside the journal in favor of watching her. "You'll need your strength if we have to move again." He complied, though his eyes remained on her face. "You didn't sleep," he observed. May didn't bother to deny it. There was too much to consider. "About William?" "Yes." May finally took a spoonful of her own porridge, more from necessity than appetite. "And about what happens after justice is served, if it is served." Gabriel set down his spoon. "What do you mean?" May met his gaze directly. "I mean that I've lived with a purpose for the past 2 years, finding the truth about what happened to my family. If that purpose is fulfilled..." She trailed off, unable to articulate the emptiness she glimpsed beyond that horizon. "Then you find a new purpose," Gabriel said simply. "The same way you did after the war, after Thomas died, after William." The matter-of-fact assessment, free of pity or platitudes, struck May as exactly right. She had reinvented herself before, would likely do so again. It was the nature of survival. "Perhaps," she acknowledged. Then, shifting topics, "We should check on Rebecca." Morrison may suspect her involvement after yesterday. Gabriel considered this. It would be risky to go into town. Not for me, May countered. I'm the local doctor. Remember, I have legitimate reasons to visit patients. Before Gabriel could argue further, a sound outside caught their attention, the distinctive creak of the front gate followed by footsteps on the porch. They exchanged a glance, both reaching for weapons automatically. A soft knock at the door, then a familiar voice. May, it's Rebecca. Huh. May moved swiftly to the door, opening it just enough to verify her friend's identity before ushering her inside. Rebecca's face was pale, a fresh bruise blooming on her cheekbone, but her eyes were clear and determined. Rebecca, what happened? May asked, leading her to a chair by the fire. Calvin, Rebecca replied simply. He suspected I knew something about your activities yesterday. When I wouldn't confirm it, She gestured to her face. It doesn't matter. I'm used to it. It does matter, May said firmly, examining the bruise with gentle fingers. This has gone beyond his usual temper. Rebecca managed a wan smile. Yes, well, so have I. She looked at Gabriel. The marshals won't be coming today. Gabriel straightened. What do you mean? There was a telegram this morning. An avalanche has blocked the pass from Casper. They won't arrive until tomorrow at the earliest. May and Gabriel exchanged a concerned glance. A day's delay might as well be an eternity, given Morrison's desperation. There's more, Rebecca continued. Calvin has called a town meeting for noon. He's claiming to have evidence that you, she nodded to Gabriel, are a wanted criminal who has corrupted Dr. Winslow into harboring you. He's organizing a search party to find and arrest you both. A lynch mob, more likely, Gabriel observed grimly. That's his intention. Yes, Rebecca agreed. But there's dissent in town. Not everyone believes Calvin's version of events, especially after... She hesitated. After what, Rebecca? May prompted gently. After I spoke to Eli Thompson at the telegraph office this morning, I told him what I know about Calvin's connection to the consortium about the evidence you've discovered. Rebecca's voice strengthened. And I had him send a telegram to the Denver Tribune detailing the situation here and the evidence you possess. May stared at her friend in astonishment. Rebecca, that was incredibly dangerous. It was necessary, Rebecca replied. If something happens to either of you, the truth won't die with you. It's already spreading beyond Morrison's reach. Gabriel looked at Rebecca with new respect. That was quick thinking, Mrs. Morrison, and very brave. A ghost of a smile touched Rebecca's lips. I've had years to think about this moment, Mr. Hurst. Years of listening to Calvin boast when he was in his cups of bandaging wounds whose origins I suspected but couldn't prove. She touched the bruise on her face. This was simply the final indignity I was willing to endure. May took her friend's hand, feeling the tremors that belied Rebecca's calm demeanor. What will you do now? Leave Coleridge, Rebecca said without hesitation. My brother has a farm in Oregon. I wrote to him last month, made arrangements. She squeezed May's hand. I've been planning this longer than you might think. A sudden pounding at the door interrupted their conversation. All three froze, eyes darting to the window, where they could see several men on horseback in the yard. It's Morrison, Gabriel said, recognizing the sheriff's tall figure at the head of the group. Winslow, Morrison's voice bellowed. Open up! We know Hurst is in there! May moved swiftly, grabbing the journal and maps from the table and thrusting them into Rebecca's hands. Take these, she said urgently. Get them to Eli Thompson. Have him hide them until the marshals arrive. Rebecca shook her head. They'll search me leaving here. Not if you go out the back, May countered. There's a path through the root cellar that leads to the woods. Thomas built it as a precaution during the early days when we feared raiding parties. I'm not leaving you to face them alone, Rebecca protested. You must, Gabriel interjected, his voice quiet but firm. Those documents are the only proof of everything we've claimed. Without them, it's merely our word against theirs. The pounding at the door grew more insistent. Last chance, Winslow, Morrison called. Open up, or we're coming in. Rebecca hesitated only a moment longer before nodding. Very well, but promise me you won't do anything foolish. Stall them. The marshals will come. We'll do what we can, May promised, already leading Rebecca toward the trap door, concealed beneath the rug in the corner. Now hurry. As Rebecca disappeared into the darkness below, May replaced the rug and moved a chair over the spot. She and Gabriel exchanged a long look, an entire conversation passing between them without words. "Ready?" she asked finally. Gabriel checked that his revolver was loaded, then nodded. "Let them come." May straightened her shoulders and moved to the door, opening it with a calmness she didn't feel. "Sheriff Morrison," she said coolly, "to what do I owe this disruption to my morning?" Morrison stood on her porch flanked by 4 deputies and 2 men. She didn't recognize strangers with hard eyes and the unmistakable bearing of hired guns. Behind them, several townspeople had gathered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. "I have a warrant for the arrest of Gabriel Hurst," Morrison announced loudly, clearly playing to the growing audience. "And for your arrest is his accomplice, Dr. Winslow." "On what charges?" May asked, keeping her voice steady. "Theft of private property belonging to the Western Irrigation Consortium, conspiracy to defame legitimate business interests, and in Hurst's case, impersonating a consortium employee." Morrison produced an official-looking document. "All properly witnessed and signed by Judge Wilson." "I see," May said, making no move to let them enter. "And these men," she nodded to the strangers, "they don't appear to be your regular deputies." "Special deputies," Morrison replied smoothly, "sworn in this morning to help maintain order in Coleridge during this unfortunate situation." May recognized the lie for what it was. These men, likely Fallon and Webb from Gabriel's list, were consortium enforcers sent to eliminate the threat she and Gabriel posed. "Well, Sheriff," she said, "as you can see, I'm alone here. Mr. Hurst left yesterday after his frostbite had sufficiently healed. I believe he mentioned continuing on to Casper." One of the strangers stepped forward. "She's lying. The man's inside. We tracked him here from the creek crossing." Morrison smiled thinly. "Dr. Winslow, I'm going to ask you one more time to step aside. Otherwise, my men will be forced to enter and search the premises." May held her ground. "Without a proper search warrant, that would be illegal, Sheriff." "I have a warrant for Hurst's arrest," Morrison countered. "That gives me the authority to search where I have reason to believe he's hiding." The legal argument might have been dubious, but with Judge Wilson in the consortium's pocket, it hardly mattered. May knew she couldn't prevent them from entering indefinitely. "Very well," she said, stepping aside, "but I want these good people to witness that I protest this violation of my home and rights as a citizen." Several of the townspeople murmured in agreement, including Tom Sanders, whose hand she had saved, and Eli Thompson from the telegraph office. May caught the latter's eye, briefly hoping Rebecca had reached him with the documents. Morrison and his men pushed past her into the cabin. Gabriel stood calmly by the fire, his hands visible and empty. "Gabriel Hurst," Morrison declared triumphantly, "you're under arrest." "On whose authority?" Gabriel asked mildly. "Yours, Sheriff, or Alexander Hargrove's?" The name sent a ripple through the crowd that had followed Morrison inside and now pressed around the cabin's perimeter. "I don't know what you're talking about," Morrison said, though his face had reddened slightly. "You're a wanted man, Hurst. Nothing more, nothing less." "Wanted by whom?" Gabriel persisted. "The law or the men who've been poisoning Whisper Creek to force landowners to sell their property?" Murmurs rose from the watching townspeople. Many of them had lost family members to mysterious illnesses in recent years, illnesses that Dr. Lewis had uniformly attributed to mountain fever or bad air. "That's a damnable lie," Morrison snapped. "The consortium has brought nothing but prosperity to Coleridge." "Shuey, has it?" May stepped forward. "Ask the families who've buried their children after they drank from the creek. Ask the widows whose husbands died in accidents after refusing to sell their land." She turned to the crowd. "Ask yourselves why every official who's supposed to protect us is so eager to defend a company that arrived just before people started dying." One of the strangers, the hired guns, moved closer to Morrison, speaking low. "This is getting out of hand. We need to shut this down now." Morrison nodded almost imperceptibly, then raised his voice again. "Enough, Hurst, you're under arrest. Dr. Winslow, you too. The rest of you clear out. This is official business." But the townspeople didn't move. If anything more had gathered, drawn by the commotion. May saw faces she recognized, patients she had treated, neighbors she had helped through difficult births and injuries. "You hear what they're saying, Cal," Tom Sanders called from the doorway. About the water my Eliza died of that fever last spring. Are you saying the consortium had something to do with it? Of course not, Morrison blustered. These are the desperate lies of criminals trying to avoid justice. Then why'd you send men to search the creek yesterday? Another voice asked. Eli Thompson said you were looking for papers, documents that would prove something. Morrison's hand moved to his gun. That's enough. I'm the law in Coleridge, and I say these two are under arrest. Anyone interfering will join them. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. The townspeople were uncertain, caught between their instinctive respect for authority and the growing suspicion that something was deeply wrong in Coleridge. It was then that a new voice spoke from the back of the crowd. I have the documents. The crowd parted, revealing Rebecca Morrison, her face still bearing the mark of her husband's brutality. In her hands, she held the leather-bound journal and maps they had retrieved from the creek. Rebecca, Morrison said, his voice dangerously soft. What are you doing? What I should have done years ago, she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Telling the truth about what you've been part of, about the men who've died because of the consortium's greed. She held up the journal. This contains records of payments to officials across the territory, including Sheriff Morrison. Payments for resolving problems that threatened the consortium's plans. She turned to the crowd, including a payment of $500 to my husband for handling labor difficulties at the mine the same day Thomas Winslow died in a so-called accident. A shocked murmur ran through the assembled townspeople. Mae felt something tighten in her chest, pride for her friend's courage, fear for her safety. Morrison's face had drained of color. You've lost your mind, he said, but the authority had leached from his voice. No, Calvin, Rebecca replied. I found it. After years of hiding from the truth, of pretending I didn't know what you were involved in. She opened the journal to a marked page. September 12, 1869, the date of the mine collapse. The date you were paid to make sure Thomas Winslow never spoke about the safety violations he'd discovered. Give me that, Morrison snarled, starting toward her. Several townsmen moved to block his path, Tom Sanders among them. Hold on now, Sheriff, Sanders said. I think we all need to hear what's in that book. The two strangers, the hired guns, exchanged glances, clearly evaluating whether the situation could be salvaged. One of them, a lean man with cold eyes, began edging toward the side of the crowd where Rebecca stood. Gabriel noticed and moved to intercept, positioning himself between the gunman and Rebecca. I wouldn't, he said quietly. The man's hand hovered near his holster. You don't know what you're getting into, friend. I know exactly what I'm into, Gabriel replied. The question is whether you're willing to add murder in front of 30 witnesses to your list of crimes. Shamanam. Something in Gabriel's tone, the absolute certainty, the lack of fear, made the gunman hesitate. In that moment of distraction, Morrison made his move. He lunged toward Rebecca, drawing his revolver as he went. Give me those papers, woman. Time seemed to slow. Mae saw Morrison's finger tighten on the trigger, saw Rebecca's eyes widen with the realization that her husband meant to kill her, saw Gabriel begin to move too far away to intervene in time. Without conscious thought, Mae drew Thomas's revolver from her pocket and fired. The shot echoed in the confined space of the cabin. Morrison stumbled, a look of surprise replacing the rage on his face as a dark stain spread across his chest. He looked down at the wound, then at Mae, incomprehension in his eyes. You, he managed before crumpling to the floor. The cabin erupted into chaos. The hired guns drew their weapons only to find themselves facing a dozen townsmen who, while not armed, outnumbered them significantly. The deputies looked to each other uncertainly, their loyalty to Morrison wavering in the face of the revelations and the sheriff's attempted murder of his own wife. Mae moved swiftly to Morrison's side, her physician's instincts overriding everything else. The wound was severe, the bullet had struck near the heart. His eyes were already glazing over, his pulse weakening under her fingers. Calvin Morrison, she said loud enough for everyone to hear. Did you arrange Thomas Winslow's death on behalf of the Western Irrigation Consortium? Morrison's eyes focused on her briefly. Had to, he gasped. He knew about the water, would have ruined everything. And my son? Mae pressed her voice steady, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. William, did you know they were poisoning the creek that killed him? Morrison's breathing grew more labored. Collateral damage, he managed. Business. Just business. They were his last words. Calvin Morrison died on Mae Winslow's cabin floor, his confession witnessed by half the town of Coleridge. In the silence that followed, Rebecca stepped forward, still clutching the damning documents. Everything he said is confirmed in these records. She said, her voice stronger now. The consortium has been systematically poisoning water sources to force land sales, bribing officials to cover up their actions and eliminating anyone who threatened to expose them. One of the deputies, a young man named Parker, who had always seemed uncomfortable with Morrison's methods, stepped forward. "I'll take charge until the marshals arrive," he said, "and I'll need those documents as evidence, Mrs. Morrison." Rebecca hesitated, looking to Mae and Gabriel for guidance. "It's all right," Gabriel said quietly. "Deputy Parker was never on the consortium's payroll. He can be trusted." Rebecca handed over the journal and maps. "There are names in there," she said. "Powerful men who've profited from the consortium's crimes. They won't simply surrender to justice." "No," Parker agreed. "They won't. But neither will they escape it." He turned to the hired guns who had lowered their weapons, but remained tense. "You two, consider yourselves under arrest until the federal marshals can sort out your involvement." The men exchanged glances, clearly calculating their odds of resistance. But surrounded by determined townspeople, they eventually surrendered their weapons. As Parker organized the deputies to secure the prisoners and Morrison's body, the crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves about the revelations. Many paused to speak to Mae, offering awkward condolences for Thomas and William, now that the truth of their deaths was known. Eventually, only Mae, Gabriel, and Rebecca remained in the cabin, the air still heavy with the scent of gunpowder. "Are you all right?" Mae asked Rebecca, who had sunk into a chair, the adrenaline of the confrontation finally wearing off. "Yes," Rebecca said softly. "Strange as it may sound, I feel free, for the first time in years." She looked at the spot where her husband had fallen. "I never thought it would end like this, but perhaps it was inevitable." "You saved us," Gabriel said. "Your courage in coming forward with those documents turned the tide." Rebecca shook her head. "I only did what should have been done long ago." She looked at Mae. "And you saved my life. He would have killed me." Mae's hand, which had held the revolver, trembled slightly now that the danger had passed. "I didn't intend to kill him," she admitted. "Only to stop him." "I know," Rebecca said. "That's the difference between you and Calvin, between justice and vengeance." The distinction resonated with Mae, who had lived so long with the desire for retribution that she had almost forgotten the true meaning of justice. Gabriel moved to the window, looking out at the dispersing crowd. "The marshals will arrive tomorrow if the pass is clear. They'll want statements from all of us." "And after that," Rebecca asked, "what will you do?" Gabriel turned back to face them. "Return to Denver, file my report with the agency." He hesitated, his eyes finding Mae's. "And then perhaps find a new purpose." The echo of their earlier conversation was not lost on Mae. A new purpose after justice, after vengeance, after the ghosts had been laid to rest. What might that look like? "You could stay," she said quietly. "Coleridge will need rebuilding after this. Trust will need to be restored." "Is that an invitation, Dr. Winslow?" Gabriel asked, a hint of something warm entering his voice for the first time. "Perhaps," Mae acknowledged. "William would have wanted us to find peace, I think. Both of us." The mention of the boy who connected them, Amelia's son, Thomas's son, Mae's son, in all the ways that mattered, settled between them like a bridge spanning their separate griefs. "Yes," Gabriel said softly. "I believe he would." Rebecca rose, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "I should go. There are arrangements to make statements to prepare for the marshals." She embraced Mae fiercely. "Thank you, my friend, for everything." After Rebecca had gone, Mae and Gabriel stood in silence for a long moment, the events of the morning still reverberating around them. "It's over," Mae said finally. "Or nearly so." "Yes," Gabriel agreed. "Though the consortium's influence extends far beyond Coleridge, this is just one battle in a larger war." "A battle won," Mae pointed out. "Justice for Thomas, for William, for all those who suffered." She moved to the window, gazing out at Whisper Creek in the distance. "The water will run clean again in time." Gabriel joined her, his shoulder just touching hers as they stood side by side. "And will you find healing in time?" Mae considered the question, feeling the weight of years of grief and anger, the burden of suspicions confirmed and justice partially served. There would be more to do, testimonies to give, a community to help rebuild, a medical practice to maintain. But beneath it all, she felt something unexpected, a tentative sense of possibility of future rather than past. "I believe I might," she said finally, "with the right purpose." Gabriel's hand found hers, a simple touch that acknowledged everything that had passed between them and everything that might yet come. Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle flakes settling on the ground like a clean page waiting to be written upon. The water of Whisper Creek continued its eternal journey, carrying away the old and bringing the new in an endless cycle of renewal. And for the first time in years, Mae Winslow looked toward that water not with suspicion or sorrow, but with hope. 1 year later, spring had come to Whisper Creek, transforming the landscape from white to vibrant green. Wildflowers dotted the meadows, and the creek itself ran clear and swift with the last of the snowmelt from the mountains. Mae stood on the bank, watching the water flow past. Behind her, Gabriel was setting out a simple picnic on a blanket spread beneath a cottonwood tree, their weekly ritual weather permitting to visit this spot where the creek curved gently around a small grassy peninsula. The spot where William had loved to fish, where his ashes now nourished the wildflowers. "It's ready," Gabriel called. Mae turned from the creek, taking in the sight of the man who had against all odds become her partner in rebuilding a life she had thought forever shattered. He was healthier now, the haunted look in his eyes softened by time and shared purpose. The Pinkerton Agency had granted his request for a permanent posting in Wyoming Territory, allowing him to continue monitoring the dismantling of the consortium's operations while establishing a new life in Coleridge. "Coming," she replied, making her way up the slight incline to the blanket. They ate in comfortable silence, enjoying the simple fare and the sounds of spring around them. Birds called from the trees, and occasionally a fish jumped in the creek, sending ripples across the surface. "I had a letter from Rebecca yesterday," Mae said after a while. "She's settled well in Oregon. Her brother's farm is thriving, and she's established herself as a midwife in the nearby town." Gabriel nodded, pleased. "She deserves peace after all she endured." "Yes," Mae agreed, "though she says she misses Coleridge sometimes. The good parts of it, at least." "There are more good parts now," Gabriel observed. "The new mayor seems committed to transparency, and Judge Wilson's replacement actually applies the law equally to everyone, regardless of their financial standing." Mae smiled. Progress indeed. The federal investigation had reached far beyond Coleridge, resulting in indictments against consortium officials in 3 territories. Alexander Hargrove was serving a prison sentence for his role in the water poisoning scheme. The hired guns Fallon and Webb had turned state's evidence in exchange for reduced sentences, providing even more details about the consortium's criminal activities. "I received a telegram from Denver this morning," Gabriel said, reaching into his coat pocket. "The final assets of the Western Irrigation Consortium have been liquidated. The proceeds are being distributed as restitution to families affected by their actions." He handed Mae an official-looking document. "This is your portion as William's guardian. The court recognized his death as directly attributable to the consortium's water contamination." Mae took the paper, but didn't open it immediately. "Money doesn't bring him back," she said softly. "No," Gabriel agreed. "Nothing does. But it acknowledges the wrong done to him, to you, and it can be used to help others." Mae nodded, an idea forming. "The clinic needs expansion. There are still children suffering from the effects of the contamination, families who can't afford proper care." "A fitting memorial," Gabriel said. They fell silent again, watching the play of light on the creek's surface. A year ago, Mae would have seen only danger in that water, only memories of loss. Now, while the memories remained, they were balanced by new associations of justice, served, of community, rebuilt, of a future reclaimed. "I've been thinking," Gabriel said after a while, "about what you said when this all began, about finding a new purpose after justice was served." Mae turned to him, curious. "And have you found one?" "I believe I have," he replied, his gray eyes warm as they met hers. "If you're willing to share it." From his pocket, he produced a small wooden box, opening it to reveal a simple gold band. "I thought perhaps we might build something new together," he said. "Not to replace what was lost, but to honor it by moving forward." Mae looked at the ring, then at the man offering it. A year ago, she would have dismissed the possibility out of hand, believing herself too damaged by grief, too hardened by suspicion to ever open her heart again. But time and truth had worked their gradual healing. The justice they had sought together had brought not only closure, but connection, a shared understanding that had deepened into something neither had expected to find again. "Yes," she said simply. "I believe we might." Gabrielle slipped the ring onto her finger, then leaned forward to seal the promise with a kiss as gentle as it was certain. Behind them, Whisper Creek continued its eternal journey, the water catching the spring sunlight and transforming it into countless glittering possibilities, each one a testament to the truth that while some wounds never fully heal, they need not define the whole of a life. Some secrets like those the creek had carried destroyed, but others like the one now shared between May and Gabriel created the foundation for something new to grow from soil once thought barren. And as they gathered their picnic and walked hand in hand along the banks of the creek that had taken so much from them, both they found themselves listening not to whispers of the past, but to the clear, bright sound of water flowing forward, always forward into an unwritten future. May stood at the edge of Whisper Creek in the golden hour of a late summer day, watching the water catch fire with sunset. Gabriel's hand found hers warm and solid against the evening chill. A year had passed since justice had found its way to Coleridge like water, finding its inevitable path downhill. She knelt to place 2 river stones on the creek bank, one larger one, small markers only she and Gabriel would recognize. Thomas and William, father and son. Their absence still echoed in the spaces between her heartbeats, a familiar ache she no longer tried to silence. "They would be proud," Gabriel said softly, the breeze carrying his words like seeds that might someday bloom. May watched the current gently nudge the stones, not enough to move them, just enough to acknowledge their presence. The water that had taken so much had also improbably given something back: connection, purpose, a future unwritten. She slipped Thomas's watch from her pocket, its steady ticking a counterpoint to the creek's whispers. Some wounds never fully healed, but perhaps they weren't meant to. Perhaps the scars were maps leading us home to ourselves. "Do you think," she asked, her voice merging with the water's song, "that memory is just another form of love that refuses to be washed away,